Sunsets really are amazing here, Avi said, admiring the red sky, which was also reflected in the surprisingly calm sea, adding some golden glow to the beauty. It's a shame we won't be here long. Usually I don't like to linger on uninhabited worlds, but I'd like to stay here for a month to rest and relax. Wasn't your last adventure enough? Sven asked. Didn't you get enough rest? Avi shuddered and finished his glass in a gulp to lighten the mood. 3 weeks of solitary confinement doesn't really fit my idea of a pleasant vacation, he said, especially with the prospect of being a lab rat as a bonus at the end of the trip. Sven shrugged and made himself comfortable on the bed. Well, Hansen made up for all our worries and inconveniences, didn't he? In fact, even this business trip of ours could be considered part of the compensation. That's true. Avi poured himself another tonic. Unfortunately, there's not much for us to do here. The planet is marvelous and seems completely safe. No serious predators, no particularly malignant microorganisms that a standard bioblockade can't cope with, not even natural disasters. It's a rare paradise world, which means there's nothing for guys like you and me to do here. But I'd still come here someday for a good vacation. Sven looked at him with a grin. Avi, have you seen the resort area designs provided by Hansen's office? Once construction is complete, the most you'll be able to afford is stereo images from orbit. Hansen is building this resort for himself and his friends, not for his subordinates, even useful ones like you and me. Well, such are the realities of our world, Avi sighed. Paradise exists, but the entrance tickets are affordable only for a select few. Still, it's nice to know it's there, and you've even had your week in it. He'd never been so wrong. Avi had long ago realized that the goddess of fate had a rather perverse sense of humor, but now she was obviously in a particularly dark mood as she refuted his rant about paradise in the most radical and unapologetic way. What could be more radical than a man with an arrow in his eye falling from the pavilion's roof onto the drinks table? The security perimeter is in place, Sven said. All teams have returned to the base. There are no more casualties except for poor Shubin. How is he, by the way? Avi looked at the unusually quiet surroundings of the base camp. No threat to his life, but Hansen will have to pay for the services of cybernetic saints from the grace of God. Evgeny lost an eye. Good thing the arrow was from far away, and the bow it came from was weak. If it had entered deeper, just a couple of centimeters, he waved his hand. He's lying in the infirmary cursing Hansen and the paradise planets. We'll have to visit him, Sven said. But that's later, and as for now, what do we know? Avi pensively patted his palm on the transparent plastic of the service dome they were in. Even though the entire base camp was now covered by a protective force field, the current order advised the staff not to unnecessarily go out into the open. Not much, he said. Shubin was working on the pavilion's roof, setting up filming equipment for the biologists. He claims he only noticed some movement at the far end of the roof, and then a sharp pain and a fall. Well, what's on the far end? Nothing much. Avi shrugged. You can see some vague footprints and some clay on the roof. There are stacks of materials and crates at the back, so anyone could have gotten on the roof. The clay dried out, but we collected samples. The chemists in the lab are working on them now. Maybe they find anything. So we have no idea who shot Shubin. Sven squinted at his friend. Look, we've been here for 3 weeks, and we haven't seen even a hint of intelligent species on the planet, even at a primitive stage of development, especially near the camp. You don't think that it was? That it was one of our people who tried to settle the score with Shubin? Avi finished the question. No. First of all, it's nonsense. Evgeny is the nicest man, and I can't imagine one of our surveyors or botanists trying to put an arrow in the head of one of his colleagues with a homemade bow. I won't even talk about motive. But most importantly, look at this. He handed Sven an arrow in a sealed plastic bag. Well, you can't argue with that, Sven said, examining the evidence. Thank God Shubin's blood had been washed off the arrow, and it looked more like a museum piece than a dangerous projectile. A typical arrow straight out of the Neolithic, small one, and primitive enough. The plumage is not taped too neatly, the shaft is not polished, and the bone tip is fixed with some solidified plant resin. You know, that's the most important evidence that a native shot it. Sven grinned wryly. Because of all our people, there's only one person who could authentically make a thing like that. Me. But I have, as you realize, an absolute alibi. One thing remains to be understood, Avi said. How did we manage to miss intelligent natives here, much less Neolithic hunters? It's unlikely they came from a neighboring continent to see who was visiting them from the stars. You'd be surprised how far Neolithic hunters can travel in a day, Sven said. But I agree. We have carefully studied a huge area, especially places where there are usually traces of primitive tribes, the shores of rivers and lakes, for example. There wasn't the slightest hint of anything like that. No campfires, trash heaps, or remnants of any kind of huts. Where had they come from? He put the arrow on the table. We need to find out as soon as possible. The presence of intelligent life on the planet changes all our plans, and Hansen's plans for a resort planet for the chosen few. I'll launch a few scout drones, Avi said. If they exist, I think we'll find them in a couple or 3 days. However, some things became obvious much sooner. The next morning, Sven had barely had time to eat breakfast and get to work parsing the detailed satellite data, hoping to find the mysterious natives, when an agitated Avi burst into the dome. They caught the drone? Sven looked at Avi incredulously. Are you serious? You bet they did, Avi nodded, and almost shot down another one. I wouldn't have believed it if I hadn't been looking at the screens. You can see for yourself. He plugged the memory crystal into the socket of Sven's computer. I cut out a few minutes from the drone's launch, leaving only the most interesting, Avi said. This drone was aimed along the river, the one west of the camp. I wanted to fly downstream to see what was going on there, but anyway, you'll see for yourself now. The drone glided over the smooth surface of the calm, narrow river. The drone glided over the smooth surface of the calm, narrow river. The camera captured the sleepy atmosphere of the early forest morning very well. The light haze, the ripples on the water from playing fish schools, and the tiny insects swirling between the leaves of the trees bent low over the river. The operator drove the drone at a slow speed to get a good look at all the details, but nothing interesting happened until the drone dived into a narrow opening between two massive fallen trunks across the riverbed. The image immediately jerked to the side, spinning, and Sven realized with amazement that the drone was caught by the fishing net. It entangled the drone in several layers, and the helpless camera, instead of the usual general plan, could see only the scraps of the surrounding environment. But the thin cord, woven from some plant fiber, and several knots connecting the cells of the net, were perfectly visible in the frame. Sven couldn't see who was holding the net, especially since they were moving quickly through the thicket. But it became clear after a couple of minutes. It can't be, he said in amazement, looking at the screen. These are our neighbors, the beavers. We studied them as soon as we arrived. They were ordinary animals. Where did they get nets, weapons, houses? Of course, the beavers didn't look much like their Earth namesakes. Surveyors dubbed them so because the way of life of these funny six-legged animals was basically the same. They built dams on small rivers, of which there were many in the coastal forests, dug burrows, huts, and steep banks, fed on all sorts of small aquatic animals, and they were no more intelligent than ordinary beavers. But now the image from the camera showed a whole village of several dozen houses, built of reeds and twigs, covered with broad leaves of big trees. Between the houses and in the village's central square were crowded inhabitants, but they no longer looked like ordinary animals. First, their posture had changed from the typical six-legged walk of the planet's fauna to four limbs, with the upper limbs now clearly used as hands, making them look like furry centaurs, the size of large dogs. Their fur was noticeably shorter, their snouts, faces, noticeably flatter, and the fingers on their upper paws, hands, much more tenacious and agile. They had no clothes, which was not surprising given the planet's very mild, flat climate, but many wore some sort of harness with bags and pouches, and some had. "Oh shit," Sven blurted out. "So that was who had shot Evgeny." The bows were small, like their owners, but quite skillfully crafted. Nothing really complicated, like the composite Mongolian bows, but it was obvious that they had been crafted with care. They weren't just bent sticks with rope like those of the most primitive tribes. All weapons were personalized, decorated with patterns and colored bindings, and obviously crafted to match to their owner's height. "That's just the beginning," Avi said. "When I came to my senses, I immediately sent another drone down there and tried to keep it higher so they wouldn't get to it with the net. But they had something else up their sleeve." The image on the screen has split into two. One showed trunks and branches from the second drone flying through the thicket toward the village. The other was a broadcast from the captured drone, showing the excited commotion of the villagers, who had obviously heard the buzzing of the approaching machine. A few of those with bows pointed their weapons skyward, putting arrows on the bowstring, but then, with guttural shouts, they put the arrows back in their quivers and rushed to a large building with wide doors, from where a minute later they pulled out a bulky structure that bore some resemblance to their personal weapons and began to draw it. "It's a ballista," Sven exclaimed. "Or a scorpion, or whatever the Romans called it. I don't know much about ancient history." Avi nodded. "Look." Just at that moment, the second drone flew out of the forest and hovered over the village, recording everything happening, but it didn't last long. The crowd of natives roared, and the ballista fired a massive bolt with an obviously metal tip into the sky with a loud crack. The drone operator was obviously a bit confused because he moved the drone aside only at the very last moment, and the projectile tangentially hit its casing, damaging the camera. The image flickered and turned into a jumble of pixels, and a moment later, the camera of the captured drone went out as well. "It looks like it's been trampled or cobbled," Avi commented. "What do you think?" Sven shook his head. "I can't believe my eyes. The village, the bows, the ballista. Where did all this come from? We couldn't have missed that." "We couldn't," Avi said, taking his memory crystal. "But somehow we did. I've launched other scouts a couple of kilometers high so the natives won't notice. So far, they've counted several hundred villages across the continent. They work the land by hand with hoes and graze some native ruminants. The Neolithic Revolution is in full swing," Sven muttered. "I don't get it. It doesn't happen overnight, out of nothing. Homo sapiens took several 100,000 years to get to this point if we take roughly the same starting point, and I flattered us a lot on that. But here, it's like overnight." "Exactly," Avi nodded. "The day before yesterday, we were discussing how we could carefully relocate the beaver colony to set up an additional camp at the mouth of the river, and we sedated a couple of specimens for study. And today, they are no longer specimens, but members of the local population." Sven gave him a sharp glance. "What about the ones that were put to sleep?" he asked. "How are they behaving? Did they suddenly become intelligent?" Avi waved his hands. "Who knows?" he said. The biologists put them both in the scanner, filmed them completely, and then released them back. Yesterday morning. And Shubin was already shot in the evening, said Sven. That's an interesting sequence of events. Avi stared at him. As always, the exo-psychologist had a knack for making logical connections where no one would have thought to look for them. No, Avi said at last. It can't be. They were just animals. I went to that dam myself when they were released. It can't be. Then what could it be? Sven asked. Do you have any other ideas? But how is it possible? Evolution in 24 hours? I don't know, said Sven, but I'd really like to find out. He looked at the lush green of the subtropical forest outside the perimeter of the base camp. I want to know, and I'm afraid. The next surprise fell upon them a few hours later. By this time, several Aboriginal villages had already been under constant surveillance from orbital and high-atmospheric vehicles. Special attention, of course, was paid to the village closest to the camp, which was being monitored by several drones and satellites at once. But much to the disappointment of Sven, Avi, and the other surveyors, nothing much was happening anywhere. The natives lived a typical late Neolithic life. They cultivated vegetable gardens, herded domesticated animals, and in a few villages there were pottery and even copper workshops. If not for the fact that all of this had appeared with the wave of a magic wand in just 24 hours, the planet would have been no different from hundreds of similar ones where the locals were just beginning to develop. Sven even remembered that he had heard of several species that were anatomically similar to beavers, that is, had 6 limbs and followed the centaur's pattern. Leaving the camp and contacting the natives was forbidden. The federal authorities also strictly monitored the safety of the primitive tribes and severely punished any unauthorized contact attempts. Sven and Avi decided that until it was clear what was happening on the planet, it was better not to take any risky steps. However, the next step was not taken by humans. The duty officer who burst into Sven's working dome looked like he was about to evolve 1,000,000 years in a few minutes himself. They're gone, he blurted out in response to Avi and Sven's questioning looks. Who's gone? Sven calmly clarified. The natives, all those villages, fields, fairs. There's nothing, like there never was. Avi's first thought was that the guy had fallen asleep at the console and confused something he'd dreamed with reality. But after clicking through the surveillance channels, he realized that was the case. It was a question of who was dreaming what, Avi thought, but pushed it away. How could all 38 people in the camp have seen the same synchronized hallucination? Was the arrow that had taken Shubin's eye away a hallucination too? Interesting, said Sven. The situation seems to be developing even faster than I thought. Interesting. Avi couldn't take it anymore. He's interested, you see. The situation is developing, you see. Can someone explain what the hell is going on here? What do we do? Stand up and march to the psychiatrist? Sven sighed, looking sympathetically at the completely distraught duty officer. No, he said. I suppose not. If this is what I think it is, then we need to break camp and get off this planet as soon as possible. Avi stared at him blankly. What do you mean, get off? How soon? Sven smiled. Right now would be best, but I think we'll have to wait until the next notice to convince Hansen. From who? Sven nodded towards the forest. From the locals, of course. Avi entered the ship's recreation and, with a sigh of relief, sank down on the comfortable, soft couch. Sven greeted him with a nod and held out a glass of tonic. So, how is Hansen? He asked. Roaring all over the place? Avi remembered the conversation with the chief and felt a slight twitch. Not anymore. He thanked Sven with a nod and sipped his tonic. The cool liquid pleasantly refreshed his parched mouth. He'd yelled at first, of course. Not surprisingly, a great project like this had gone wrong. But this case had gone into circles that even Hansen couldn't handle. Your report to patrol seems to have made a lot of noise. According to Hansen, it's got the whole place in a tizzy. Sven looked very seriously straight in the Avi's eyes. I hope they are as scared as I am. The case is indeed very serious, the likes of which we have never encountered before. Even comparing to that artifact you discovered on Agasphere? Sven shook his head. Well, first of all, I'm not the only one who discovered it. And secondly, we have no influence on the artifact at all. All we can do is stay away from it and hope we haven't triggered some incredible universal mechanism of the precursors. The natives of Paradise Planet are a different matter. Here, we can have an impact, or rather, we already have. Avi poured himself more tonic from the crystal decanter. Maybe you can finally tell me exactly what happened there. Of course, when the first cannonballs and musket bullets hit the protective power field around the camp, it became crystal clear to everyone that it was time to run. But what the hell was that all about? I feel like everybody knows but me. You know, Patrol knows, Hansen knows. I still haven't figured out what's going on. I'm sorry. I should have explained it to you right away. But in the hustle and bustle of packing, I didn't have time for that. And then you dropped dead asleep until Hansen called you over the hyperlink. Sven raised his eyes dreamily to the ceiling. Damn, how much money your boss has. I can't even imagine how much a direct hyperlink session across several hundred light years costs. If I hadn't used the protocol ZX0, my report to Patrol would have been waiting at least another week. What's that protocol? Avi couldn't resist, though eager to learn everything about Paradise Planet. It's a patrol instruction that gives absolute priority to information critical to humanity's survival, Sven said. Avi smiled uncertainly, but the exo-psychologist was completely serious. Wait, you're not kidding? Sven shook his head. It's no time for jokes. In fact, we're lucky I still have access to the patrol's codes. The last time the protocol was used was on Agasphere. Avi stared at his friend, stunned. No, I understand that these guys on Paradise Planet are something special, but for God's sake, a threat to humanity in the form of an army from the Napoleonic Wars. And if I remind you that they got to this army from a state of pre-intelligent animals in 2 days of real time? That's what I don't understand, Avi said, confused. How did they manage to do such a trick, and why is that a threat to us? The fact that they did it with such ease is the biggest threat. You see, unlike most of humanity, for whom what happened on Agasphere is still obscure news from some half-mythical corner of the galaxy, I've experienced time manipulation firsthand, and I know for a fact that it's possible. I believe that the native inhabitants of Paradise Planet are able to go back in time or create some kind of closed time pockets within which they experience enough years to evolve biologically and then follow the path of scientific, technological, and historical development. They're time travelers, Sven shrugged. I don't know for sure, I'm not a physicist after all, but they do something with time, and those possibilities really scare me. Avi twirled his glass in his hands, puzzled. Wait. But they've lived on their wonderful planet for God knows how many years, not rushing to evolve anywhere and racing through time back and forth like kids on gravity surfing. Sven looked at him reproachfully. Avi, you're a xenobiologist, even if you haven't worked in your specialty for a day. It's very simple. Remind me why our distant ancestors went on the great quest of evolution and became Homo sapiens. But, for example, gorillas and chimpanzees never learned to speak and write, although their brains are quite capable of it, as thousands of experiments have shown. Because the environmental conditions of our ancestors began to change dramatically, and they had to adapt, and gorillas and chimpanzees lived in their jungles, to which they were already perfectly adapted and continued to live there. It's the basics. Avi stopped abruptly, realizing where the exo-psychologist was going. Shit. Well, you finally figured it out, Sven nodded. We didn't call the planet paradise for nothing. It's a very comfortable place to live. They lived there. They used their chrono abilities only to catch fish more efficiently and move their huts before the rainy season so they wouldn't get flooded. And then we came along and started changing their environment. We kidnapped them, wandered right around their dwellings, made noise, and scooped water out of the dam. Hell, I think the guys even went fishing in that river. And then they were also attacked by strange flying objects. I think they thought they were demons then. And they began to actively accelerate their time loops to adapt. It was during these accelerations that we lost sight of them. Sven sipped his tonic and set his glass on the table. I just hope they'll relax a little after we leave. The patrol will, of course, quarantine the planet. But it's a question of who the quarantine will protect. The natives of Paradise Planet, or all the galaxy civilizations from them. Avi was slowly trying to comprehend what he had heard. Oh my God. They jumped millions of years of evolution in literally a day of our time. And then another 10 to 20,000 years or so in a matter of hours. If we keep poking them with a stick, it's scary to even think who or what they could become in a few years. Sven shook his head. That's half the trouble. What if this ability to enter protective evolutionary cycles is inherent in not only our Centauro beaver friends, but also other living organisms on Paradise Planet? Avi's jaw dropped. When we left, the natives had already developed industry and steam engines, Sven said. We know very well how industry affects the environment, especially at the beginning of the scientific and technological revolution. What if the entire biosphere of Paradise Planet starts an evolutionary leap under the influence of the first generation? Avi swallowed. Then we'd probably end up in quarantine ourselves. He thought for a moment. I hope they don't decide to turn our galaxy into an elite fishing resort.